What if being alone isn't peaceful, but quietly lethal? He woke up to silence. Not the gentle, comforting kind, but the silence that feels like something watching you. The kind that settles too deep into your bones, like dust in a forgotten room. At 6:12 a.m., he opened the window. The light came in, but it didn't feel warm. Just pale. Thin. Like it didn't quite want to be there. The coffee didn't steam the way it used to. Or maybe it did, but no one noticed. Not even him. Thomas, 67, had lived alone for nearly a decade. No wife. No partner. No kids that called. The house was clean. Too clean. The couch uncreased. The bed always made. There were no shoes by the door, no voices in the kitchen. Just the low mechanical breath of the refrigerator and the ticking of a wall clock. He hadn't changed since daylight saving time, 3 years ago. He didn't cry. Not because he was strong, but because there was no one to see the tears. And over time, that made them unnecessary. He spoke less each month. First, to others. Then, to himself. Then, not at all. There were days when his voice felt foreign. The neighbors assumed he was fine. He waved when they passed. He brought in his mail. He watered the same 2 plants. But no one saw what was happening behind the drawn curtains. The slow erosion of meaning. The days that blurred without memory. The meals eaten not because of hunger, but because not eating felt like giving up. And yet, he never complained. Never asked for help. That's the danger. Not the loud kind that screams for rescue, but the quiet kind. The invisible kind. The kind nobody saw coming. There was a time Thomas was never alone. A time when his name meant something. Someone used to say it aloud. Over breakfast. From the bathroom mirror. Whispered in the dark. Thomas, come here. Thomas, could you grab the keys? Tom. And then, one day, it stopped. Not like a door slammed shut, but like a radio dial slowly turning to static, until the music was gone and nobody remembered the song. He had been a husband. A manager. A man who always arrived early. Who held open doors and paid bills on time. He didn't miss birthdays. Didn't skip doctor's appointments. His house had a mortgage, and the garage had tools neatly arranged on a pegboard. He was dependable, predictable, necessary. But over time, the people who needed him didn't. His wife left after 26 years. We stopped talking, she said. You stopped seeing me. And maybe she was right. He had been tired. Not of her, but of holding everything together. He didn't fight when she packed. Didn't beg. Just helped load the car and stood in the driveway as the taillights disappeared into a life that no longer included him. After that, the days began to lose their names. Monday felt like Thursday. Sunday felt like a hallway with no doors. He filled the silence at first. Music, television, podcasts, anything to avoid hearing the sound of nothing. But eventually, even that became noise. And so he turned it all off. That's when it started. The slow fading. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just small things. He stopped opening the blinds. He stopped cooking real meals. He stopped answering calls that didn't have names attached. His footsteps echoed in the hallway like someone else's life. The living room couch was always untouched, the armchair indented from only one body, always in the same spot. He sat with his back to the window. Sunlight made him feel too exposed. He didn't mean to isolate. He told himself he was just resting. That retirement was meant to be quiet. That it was okay to be alone. After all, he wasn't in pain. He wasn't sick. But that was the danger. He was in pain. Just not the kind you can point to. Not the kind a doctor can fix. He hadn't hugged another human in 3 years. He hadn't heard someone laugh with him in longer. There were days when he didn't hear his name at all. And in that silence, something vital began to slip away. Slowly, like steam from a mug that nobody drinks. He used to set an alarm, even though he had nowhere to be. It gave him the illusion of structure, of choice. He'd get up, make instant coffee, sit at the same stool by the counter, and stare at the wall while the radio played songs he didn't like, just so something in the room would sound alive. The mugs stayed clean. The floor always swept. The plants on the sill stayed green, mostly because they didn't ask for much. He told himself this was peace. That silence was freedom. But something about the way the hours passed, slow, muffled, shapeless, didn't feel like freedom. It felt like waiting. For what, he couldn't say. Maybe a knock. A wrong number call. A letter. Anything to confirm that the world still had him in it. Once, he caught himself watching his reflection in the microwave door. Not to check his face. Just to see movement. To prove he was still there. He laughed at that. A strange, hollow sound that startled even him. There were moments he didn't recognize himself, not because of age, but because he hadn't looked in so long. He stopped shaving. Not out of rebellion, but because no one would notice if he did. He wore the same sweater for days. Ate standing up. Sat in the car sometimes just to feel like he was going somewhere. He tried volunteering once. Went to the local shelter. Filled out a form. But the questions felt too sharp. Emergency contact? Preferred pronoun? Recent health issues? He left before they called his name. It felt too close to being seen, and too far from being understood. Friends had stopped checking in. Not out of cruelty, but because they thought he was fine. That's the thing with men like Thomas. They answer every, "How are you?" with "good." They don't say, "I haven't spoken to someone in 3 days. I haven't felt real in weeks. I don't remember the last time someone said my name with warmth." They just nod, say, "Good," and carry on. Because somewhere deep inside, they've been taught that suffering quietly is strength. That speaking is weakness. That needing is shameful. So they fold into themselves, day by day, like paper that's been creased too many times. Until one day, they disappear, not in death, but in presence. Alive, but no longer living. And no one notices. Because the danger wasn't loud. It was quiet. Invisible. The kind of danger nobody saw coming. He first noticed it one evening when he couldn't remember what day it was. Not just the number, but whether it was a weekday or a weekend, whether the grocery store would still be open, or if it had already closed hours ago without him noticing. The clocks ticked as they always had, but the hours no longer meant anything. He had nowhere to be, no one waiting. No task left undone because there were no tasks that mattered. He stood at the kitchen sink, staring at his hands under the cold water. They didn't look like his. The skin had thinned. The veins more visible. These were hands that had once built shelves, cradled a sleeping child, held a lover's waist in the dark. Now they trembled slightly, not from sickness but from unused purpose. That night, he cooked rice but forgot to eat. The pot sat cooling on the stove while he sat in the hallway, back against the wall, lights off, not sad, not afraid, just gone. Not the kind of gone that leaves a note. The kind that fades without anyone noticing. The silence was no longer peaceful. It pressed against him like a second skin. The refrigerator hum became louder. The walls felt closer. Even his own breath felt unfamiliar, like someone else was exhaling through him. He turned on the TV but couldn't follow the dialogue. He opened a book but reread the same sentence until it lost its meaning. He tried going for a walk but turned around halfway without knowing why. That's when the questions started creeping in. Would anyone notice if I stopped showing up to the world? If my porch light stayed off? If the mail piled up for weeks? If my name was never spoken aloud again? He didn't panic. He didn't cry. He just sat with those questions, as if they were guests who had arrived uninvited but refused to leave. He stopped calling his daughter. Not out of anger, but because the last few conversations had felt like paperwork, necessary, polite, hollow. He stopped answering unknown numbers. stopped opening emails. Even the junk mail felt too personal, like a stranger pretending to know him. And in that narrowing space, where the outside world no longer reached in and he no longer reached out, something in him dimmed. Not dead, just flickering. A man who used to be a name, a role, a person, slowly becoming a shape in a chair, a shadow behind a curtain, a forgotten presence in a house that kept on humming. The danger had arrived. And it looked like nothing at all. It got worse in the smallest ways. He began skipping showers, not because he didn't care, but because the routine started to feel pointless. No one would see him. No one would notice if his shirt had been worn 3 days in a row. He ate the same meal every night, toast and eggs, not out of preference but because it was the only thing that didn't require thought. The kitchen became a place of muscle memory, not nourishment. He moved slower, not from age, but from the absence of rhythm. Without conversation, without friction, without laughter or interruption, time lost its edges. Every hour bled into the next. Days felt like long, continuous shadows stretching across the same 4 walls. He stopped playing music. It felt too alive, too full of someone else's heartbeat. He couldn't bear it. It reminded him of a life that still had movement. Now, silence wasn't background, it was a weight. It followed him from room to room, sat beside him at the table, climbed into bed with him at night. Sometimes he'd wake up in the dark and listen for any sound beyond his own breathing. When none came, he'd lay there, eyes open, waiting for morning like it was something borrowed, not earned. He tried writing once. Pulled out a notebook, stared at the first blank page, then put it back in the drawer. He didn't know what to say. There was no one to say it to. His thoughts felt unshaped, as if even language had begun to leave him. He remembered things at random. Her perfume. His son's voice as a boy. The sound of keys dropped on the entry table. They arrived not as memories, but as ghosts, fragments without warmth. He didn't chase them. He just let them pass. One morning, he sat on the porch and tried to count how many days had passed since someone touched him. Not a hug. Not a handshake. Just a hand on his shoulder. He couldn't remember. His skin felt foreign to even himself. That day, he looked in the mirror and whispered his own name. Not for affirmation. Not for drama. Just to make sure it still existed. The sound felt strange. Like an echo from someone else's mouth. It didn't comfort him. It didn't scare him either. It just reminded him of something he already knew, that the world was continuing without him. And he was letting it. Quietly. Almost willingly. Because when aloneness becomes normal, danger doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives dressed as routine. As ordinary. As harmless. That's the danger nobody saw coming. He started talking to objects, not out loud at first, just in thought. The kettle, the curtain, the creaky floorboard near the hallway. They became companions in the way that only the truly unseen understand. One morning, after setting his mug down a little too hard, he murmured, "Sorry," and then paused. Not because it was strange, but because it felt natural. That mug had been there for him every morning. More than most people. He laughed. Not with humor. But with that dry, accidental breath that escapes when something inside you tips slightly out of balance. He began walking differently. Slower, not from weakness, but caution. Not of falling, but of being seen. His body felt like an outline of a man, not the man himself. In the grocery store, he wandered aisles without reason. Held cans just to feel their weight. Sometimes he'd push a cart with nothing in it, just to look busy. To blend. To not be watched. But he was never watched. That was the point. At the checkout, the cashier would ask, "Find everything okay?" He would smile and nod. Sure. What else was there to say? I'm not here for food. I'm here because my house forgot my name. At home, he left the television on, volume low, just for movement. The flickering light across the wall felt like company, not people. just presence. A soft reminder that something somewhere was still in motion. He stopped locking his door. Not from neglect, but because he realized no one would come. The danger wasn't outside. It was already in. It lived with him, woke with him, slept beside him, and it didn't wear a mask. It wore routine. It wore quiet. It wore his own face. That week, he found an old photograph. Him in his 40s. Arms around a woman he once loved. A barbecue in the background. Laughter frozen in time. He stared at it for a long while. Not with longing but confusion. Who was that man? How had he become this one? Was there a single moment where the shift occurred, or had it been so slow it never made a sound? He placed the photo back in the drawer. Closed it gently. It wasn't regret he felt. It was distance. As if that version of him had belonged to someone else. He was no longer grieving what had been lost. He was living with what had never returned. And in that quiet house, surrounded by things he once chose, he began to ask the question most men are too afraid to speak aloud. What happens when no one needs you anymore, and you forget how to need yourself? There was a day when he stayed in bed until 3 p.m. Not out of depression, not quite. More like inertia. The weight of existing had grown heavy in a way that didn't scream, it just settled. He watched the light shift across the ceiling, slow and indifferent. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower buzzed, birds chirped, the world carried on. But in his room, time thickened. The sheets smelled like stillness. His own skin felt like a coat he hadn't chosen. When he finally stood up, the silence followed. Not accusingly, just closely, like it knew him better than he knew himself. He made tea he didn't drink, toast he didn't eat, sat down and stared out the window, wondering if the tree across the street had grown or if he had simply stopped noticing it. That evening, he stood in the hallway and reached for the light switch, and then paused. There was something eerie about how automatic it had become. How he moved through the house not with intention, but with programming. As if his body remembered living even when he didn't. He flipped the switch. The bulb hummed. Nothing felt different. And that's when it hit him. Not as panic, but as understanding. He had not been alive. He had simply not died yet. And somewhere in the stillness between those two truths, he realized that solitude had crossed a line. That living alone too long doesn't just numb you, it erases you. Softly, sweetly, without pain. Like fog over a coastline, until the shape of the land beneath it disappears completely. He stood there for a long time, under the humming light, and said his own name. Not loud, not desperate, just enough to hear it spoken aloud in the house again. And then, for the first time in months, maybe years, he did something that wasn't part of the routine. He opened the front door. Not to leave. Not to invite anyone in. But just to feel the night air. Just to remember that there was a world beyond the walls that had quietly become his coffin. The breeze touched his face like a question. He didn't answer it. He didn't have to. Because in that moment, he wasn't fixed. He wasn't healed. But he was aware. And awareness, however fleeting, is how men begin to return. He didn't wake up the next morning with a plan. There was no dramatic decision, no motivational speech in the mirror, no music swelling in the background. Just a breath. A long, slow breath that didn't feel heavy. That was new. He sat up. The air through the open window was cool, sharp. A crow called from somewhere distant. He listened. That was all. He just listened. It was the first time in months he had heard a sound without immediately turning away from it. He got dressed without thinking too much, an old flannel shirt, worn but clean. Pants that still fit. Socks that didn't match. He made toast again. But this time, he sat down with it. Ate slowly. No television. No noise. Just the sound of crust breaking, of tea being sipped, of his own mouth moving. He didn't feel joy. He didn't even feel better. But he felt present. That alone was extraordinary. He stepped outside. Not far, just to the porch. The morning sun fell through the trees in long, golden strands. Dust floated in the light like tiny invitations. He swept the porch for the first time in weeks. The broom made a sound that pleased him, a kind of gentle scraping that reminded him of childhood, of helping his father in the garage, of sawdust on the floor. He smiled. It surprised him. His face didn't quite know how to shape the smile anymore, but it came. That afternoon, he walked down the road. Just a little. Past the mailbox, to where the gravel met the trees. He didn't bring his phone. He didn't even check the time. A breeze brushed his shoulder, and he closed his eyes to feel it. Not escape. Not distraction. Just feeling. The first hint of something unnamed began to stir inside him. Not hope, not yet. But the outline of it. Like the shape of land beneath melting fog. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. But he knew, quietly, that he had taken a step. Not back. Not forward. Just inward. And that was enough for now. The days that followed didn't transform him. They didn't arrive dressed in purpose or clarity. But they passed differently. Slower. Softer. As if time had stopped punishing him for not filling it. He began to notice things again. The sound of his own footsteps on the hardwood. The way the kettle clicked when it was just about to boil. The faint scratch of pen on paper when he wrote. Not because he had something important to say, but because he wanted to remember what his own handwriting looked like. He started writing single sentences. Short, unfinished thoughts. The light is warm on my left shoulder. I didn't feel alone when the wind came through the screen. I am still here. No one would ever read them. That made them more honest. The backyard, once just a patch of ignored grass, slowly became a place again. He trimmed the overgrowth. Found an old chair buried under a tarp. Sanded it down. Repaired a cracked leg. Sat in it and watched the sky turn. There was no pride in it, only stillness. He didn't share pictures. He didn't post updates. The change wasn't for anyone else's eyes. He began cooking again. Not every day. Not well. But better than toast. Sautéed onions, a soft egg, a bit of thyme he picked from a pot he'd forgotten on the windowsill. He ate by the window now. Let the light fall on the table. Sometimes, he even left the window open. The air smelled like pine and old leaves. The house no longer felt like a cave. It felt like shelter. One afternoon, a package came. A mistake. The wrong address. He walked it next door, knocked once. A woman in her 50s opened, surprised. "Oh, thank you," she said. "I've been waiting for that." He nodded. "It landed with me first," he said. She smiled. That was all. But it was the first human exchange in months that didn't feel obligatory. It felt real. He walked home slowly. The wind passed through the trees and over his shoulders like something blessing him without needing permission. He didn't rush inside. He stood on his porch, held the moment gently in both hands, and let it stay. He didn't count the days anymore. He marked them by moments instead. The smell of garlic on his fingers after cooking. The way the sunset light bent through the hallway mirror. The sound of rain tapping on the metal gutter and how it reminded him he was still part of something moving, even when standing still. He didn't chase meaning. He noticed it. In the way steam curled from a fresh mug. In the way the cat from 2 houses down had started visiting his porch every morning without asking. In how he had stopped feeling surprised by silence and started hearing its shape. There were still long nights. Hours that stretched without shape. Memories that returned uninvited and stayed too long. But he no longer met them with resistance. He let them in. Let them sit in the room with him like old songs he didn't skip. He realized healing hadn't arrived like a miracle. It had arrived like dust settling on furniture he'd finally stopped trying to keep spotless. Slowly. Quietly. without applause. He bought himself a new pair of socks, something no one else would ever notice. But he noticed. He lit candles at night, not for prayer, but for presence. He kept the porch light on, not in hope someone would come, but because it made the house feel awake. He no longer felt the need to explain his solitude. Not to himself. Not to anyone. It had become a language. One only he needed to speak. And in that stillness, he realized he hadn't beaten the danger. He had met it, sat with it, learned its name, and it no longer frightened him. Because once you name the silence, it loses its power to erase you. He was still alone, but no longer disappearing. He no longer measured life by companionship, but by presence, his own. There were no reunions, no second chances with old loves, no surprise visits from children carrying flowers and overdue forgiveness. There was just him. A man with a wooden floor beneath his feet, a window that faced west, and a chair that creaked only slightly when he leaned back to listen to the world breathe. He still remembered what it felt like to be missed. But the ache of not being missed had softened. It had folded itself into the quiet like an old blanket. There were mornings now when he sang without realizing. Just a low hum while folding laundry, or a fragment of melody while boiling water. The sound wasn't pretty, but it belonged to him. And that was enough. One evening, just before dusk, he sat outside as the air cooled and the trees darkened. A neighbor passed by and nodded. He nodded back. No words. No obligation. Just two humans sharing space in a world that never promised to understand them. He watched until the figure disappeared around the bend, then turned his eyes upward. The sky had taken on that soft, bruised color that only happens once a day. He watched it with a stillness he no longer questioned. He didn't want to capture it. He didn't take a photo. Some beauty, he had learned, is meant to vanish. He no longer feared being forgotten. The truth was, he had remembered himself. In the smallest ways. In the way he made his bed. In how he stirred his tea. In the choice to open a window, or let the breeze in just a little longer. He had become, at last, someone he could sit beside. And if you were to ask him now, what was the danger? He might smile. Not the smile of victory, but of recognition. He'd say, the danger wasn't being alone. The danger was never returning to myself. He doesn't need to be saved. He doesn't need to be celebrated. He just needs space to be, unobserved, unjudged, unafraid. And if you, too, have lived that silence, if you've chosen a quiet that others mistake for emptiness, leave something small behind. A single mark. A dot. To say, I'm still here. And I've heard the silence, too.